starting with the governance in India before and after the entrance of the British. So, well before the entrance of the British, we had well organized, proper self-local governance system. We had self-local governance system which was proper, and it primarily focused on the community affairs and resolved the problems among people and also took care of the public works. So these were the primary criteria of the local self-governance which was there in India, which was well organized and properly placed. But after the entrance of the British, so when British entered, they first started to lower down the importance of self-governance. So they did not want self-governance to be happening in India, where the people in their own place will be able to solve their problems. So what they wanted was a centralized bureaucracy. They never wanted the decentralization of the power. They always wanted centralized bureaucracy. So they first started to lower down the importance for self-governance. So what did they primarily focus on? They focused on the tax collection and to maintain the law and order. So our local governance used to focus on all these aspects, that is the community affairs, resolve problems, and also about the public work. But what the British focused was on the tax collection and to maintain the law and order. So due to this centralized bureaucracy, what were the problems were? It was time consuming, because all the problems will be centralized in one place, which is the court or anything else where they wanted to have this centralized bureaucracy. So it is more time consuming. For suppose if you have a problem in your village, you can just go to your village head and say the problems from both sides of the parties, and they'll be able to solve the problem instantly, or by recognizing all the facts or studying all the facts or listening to both the sides immediately, they'll have their say. But when it comes to centralized bureaucracy, you will have to present the case and we'll have both the parties and arguments and all these things will be happening. So it is a lot of time consuming process, and also all this will be happening in foreign language. So when you go opt for local self-governance, you will be having a local language. For suppose if you have your Hindi, then the people will be speaking in Hindi and you can say your problems directly. But when it comes to the British, after the entrance of British, it has started to be in the foreign language, which is say English. So we Indians initially weren't well known or weren't prepared to speak in English. So our problems are more difficult to be heard. So the two major problems were, it is more time consuming and it was happening in the foreign language. So these were the primary variations in between the governance which was happening before the British and after the British. So prior to British, it was self-governance, but after the entrance of British, it was based on centralized bureaucracy. So another major problem for this centralized bureaucracy is that it is also expensive. So you have to go for a lawyer, and it is a lot of time consuming process. So it is also an expensive affair. Next part was focusing on the Indian education. How were we studying? So initially we used to have pathshalas, madrasas or viharas, where we had practical knowledge which is told to us, plus we had our cultural values and traditions which were passed on from generations to generations. So in our Pathshalas, we had both the practical knowledge which is told to us as well as the cultural values and traditions were also imparted to us in our education. But what the British wanted to do was they wanted to create brown Englishmen. So first when they entered into India, when the British entered into India, it was a completely different society. What the Britain had or what they knew were not known in India, and what India knew were not known by the Britishers. So what they wanted was to convert the Indian people into Englishmen, that is to make or to create brown English men. So they wanted to first impart their Britain knowledge into Indians. So for this, one important thing you need to remember is 1835 in the Minute on Indian Education, which was written by Thomas.B. Macaulay. He was a historian and a politician. So their primary objective was Indian whose blood and color. So by blood and by his color, he is an Indian. But his taste and his opinions and the morals and intellect should be that of the English or that of the British. So the way he looks should be like an Indian, and the blood which flows through him is obviously Indian. But imparting the British knowledge to the Indian person will make him transform into a brown Englishman, where all his opinions, morals and intellect will be converted into as that of the British. So this was the primary goal which the Britishers focused on, that is to first change the education system in India and make them think like Britishers and adapt to the British rules which they are going to be implying on the people in the future. So next point was reshaping the economic structures in India. So first we spoke about the governance, the second is about the education. Now focusing on the economic structures in India. So they wanted to change the economic structures in India so that Indian economy can serve for the British. So basically a country's economy should be able to help the local people, that is the people, citizens of the country. But the British wanted to change this economic structure of India so that its income will be useful or it will serve the British needs. So prior to the British, we had self-sufficient economic structure. So what was our self-sufficient economic structures model? Was that we were primarily focusing on the agricultural system. So most of us were based on agriculture, and we also focused on craft and manufacture productions. So this was the primary thing which made India self-sufficient. We were able to produce our own food grains and also own clothing materials and all these things, and so we were self-sufficient. So our primary focus was on agriculture and then the craft and manufacture production. So that is the same reason which is attracted the British, because we were wealthy and self-sufficient in our nature. But what they wanted India to become, that is after they had changed the economic structures in India slowly, after the British dominance was there in India, then India, being an agricultural system focusing primarily on agriculture, and it was self-sufficient. But later, after the entrance of the British, it has become a supplier of raw materials. So you have primarily become a supplier of raw materials. So initially we used to make proper high quality clothes, but later, after the industrialization which has happened in the British, they used to only take the raw materials from India and they used to make the finished goods and brought them back to India and made India a market forced by British goods. So initially we had our own self-made goods. So we were focused on craft and also the manufacture of goods. So the proper clothing, woven saris and all these things were Indian made. But later, after the entrance of British, it had become a supplier of raw materials only. So all the raw material was taken back to British, and with the machine industrialization, they used to make the proper cloth and make India a forced market. So they only wanted India to buy their goods and they used to take the raw materials in cheap cost to British. So we've already seen about the import and export and all these things, and how the agricultural farmers have become the workers, weavers have become workers, and all these things were already seen in the previous parts. So in this way, India being self-sufficient has actually become a forced market forced to by the British goods. So initially, we used to also think that we had some colonial blessings as well, even though colonial was actually not a blessing for us, but it has damaged us in many ways. But some people think that it has also blessed in some of the ways. So one such example is the railway network which we have in India, and the telephone connections as well, or the telegraph network. So these two are referred to as the colonial's blessings. In the sense, for the colonization for all these years, one such advantage was we had got the railway connectivity. But what has the plus and minus, pros and cons for this is that the first major pro for India was that it has connected people nearer, because initially, prior to railway network, the connectivity between people wasn't that easy. So after the railway network properly placed railway tracks and all these things, it has connected people more nearer, and we were able to do the trade as well. So there was an increase in the internal trade. So initially, because there was a long travel and all these things, people used to not move from one place to another. They used to stay in their own village and supply their goods or make trade, barter systems and all these things. But after the railway network, the connectivity was easier, and so there was a boost in the internal market on internal trade as well. So, but what was the reason that the British has made this railway network? What was their reasons? Was that they wanted to move their raw materials quicker, because they do not want it to be late from the interior to the ports. So whatever the raw materials they collect, they wanted to move it quickly to the ports, and that is the reason why they have connected the railway network. But it has also helped Indians to connect people and also for the internal trade as well. But the primary reason they wanted to do it was that they wanted to move the raw materials from interior to the ports quicker. So that was for the export. So it is actually to harm in the Indian market that they have bought this railway network, but it has slightly helped us as well. But still, this was built only by our tax paid money itself. It is not the gift or something or charity that they have kept their money invested in our country. It is our money that they have invested and for their own needs, and it indirectly has helped us in some of the ways. So it is a colonial blessing for sure, but it was not completely a blessing. It was for their own good that they have done something like that. And the same thing has happened with the telegraph network as well. So for this we can say that Indians funded their own subjugation, because we ourselves were funding to build the railway network, which is indirectly harming us because they were taking the raw material and bringing the finished goods to us. So even though we Indians were paying it and they have built the network, so that is why it is rightly said that Indians have funded their own subjugation. So in this part, we have started with the governance structures prior and after the entrance of the British. So before British colonization, India possessed well-organized systems of local self-governance. Village councils, it is important to remember, village councils managed the community affairs, resolved disputes and organized the public works such as irrigation, roads, etc. And the regional kingdoms maintained the complex administrative structures that had evolved over centuries to address the local needs and the conditions. So we had the regional kingdoms as well, and our village councils focused on community affairs, resolved the disputes and also organized the public works. So Charles Metcalfe, an acting Governor General in the 1830s, has said that the village communities are little republics, having nearly everything they want within themselves, and they seem to last where nothing else lasts. Dynasty after dynasty tumbles down, revolution succeeds to revolution, but the village community remains the same. This union of these village communities, each one forming a separate little state in itself, has contributed more than any other cause for the preservation of people in India. So this is what Charles Metcalfe has told, who was an active governor at that time in the 1830s. So even though whatever has lasted, whoever has revolted, whoever has done whatever they wanted for the freedom, but at the end of the day, the village communities have been together, and that was the thing which has kept us Indians united at the end of the day. So the British systematically wanted to end this indigenous governance systems because that was what is binding the people. So they wanted to first break down these village communities. So they wanted to replace them with a centralized bureaucracy, which was primarily to facilitate the tax collection and to maintain order. They were not interested in the public welfare. They were interested in tax collection and to maintain order. So this transformation has destroyed centuries old mechanisms of community decision making. So when they have brought up this centralized bureaucracy, this has actually damaged our ages old mechanisms of village communities. So this introduction of the British codes of law have disregarded the customary laws and practices that had governed the Indian communities for generations. While presented as modernization, this imposition of the foreign system unsuited in India alienated the ordinary Indians from the judicial system, creating courts that were expensive, time consuming and were conducted in the foreign language, as I already explained about this previously. So transforming the Indian education. So they wanted to transform the Indian education by creating brown Englishmen. So by blood and color we will be Indian, but by our thoughts, morals and understanding we will be as that of the Englishmen. That is what they wanted to transform in Indian education. So education became a powerful tool for the creation of a class of Indians who could serve the British interests. So in earlier centuries, India had diverse educational traditions, pathshalas, madrasas, viharas and many forms of apprentice learning, and these institutions transformed not only the practical knowledge but also the cultural values and traditions which are passed on from generations to come. Even in the early 19th century, British reported hundreds and thousands of village schools across India, and where young natives are taught reading, writing and arithmetic once upon a system of so economical and at the same time so simple and effectual. So, sharp turning point in the India's education history was marked by a notorious 1835 minute on the Indian education of the British historian and politician Thomas.B. Macaulay. In it, although he admitted that he had no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, he expressed his conviction that European knowledge was vastly superior to that of Indians, and I had never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Indians therefore needed British education whose objective would be to create a class of Indians who could be Indian in blood and color, but the English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So, Thomas B. Macaulay has always thought that the English knowledge was far more useful or far more vast than the Indian knowledge which was in Sanskrit or in Arabic. He did not know any of the languages, but still he had the opinion that English knowledge, the European knowledge, was superior to that of India's. So, although a few prominent British Orientalists argued that Indian students could be left to study in their own languages, so some people have argued that they have to study in their own language rather than a foreign language. Macaul's policy gained the upper hand, and India's traditional schools slowly were not found, while English became a language of prestige which was associated with the colonial masters, resulting in lasting divisions in the Indian society between the English educational elites and the masses. So initially we were all united by our education, that we had our local education, but later it has become like an elite matter. If you know English, if you know the English language and the English policies, people used to think it was an elite matter, and so people started to divide among Indians, and they started to learn the English knowledge, and this has divided the English educated elites and the masses who did not learn English. The new education system served multiple colonial objectives. It created a pool of Indian clerks and minor officials who could staff the lower ranks of the colonial administration at a fraction of the cost of the British personals. So they had got the cheap workers. By imparting their education system into us, they would be able to get the lower rank workers as well. And it is also sidelined the traditional sources of knowledge and authority, creating generations of Indians who were not knowing about our rich cultural heritage. So we have lost the connection with our culture and traditions. So next was the economic structures. So the British has transformed India's economy from a self-sufficient economy, agricultural system supplemented by craft and manufacture production, into a supplier of goods for the British industry and a market forced to buy the British goods. Without going into the technical details of this whole thing, let us take the example of the construction of India's vast railway network, often cited as the colonial blessing. While the railways did bring people closer together and integrated India's internal trade, it was primarily made to move the raw materials from interior to the ports for the export and to distribute the manufactured goods throughout India. So the railway routes largely ignored the existing trade patterns to serve the colonial economic interests. Another purpose was to move the armies quickly from their cantonments if they had to fight a war or something. So if there is some rebellion in some place, they wanted to move the armies and the equipments quickly. So this railway network has also helped them in such a way as well. Besides, the construction of India's railways was not a gift from the colonial rulers to India. Most of it was paid by the Indian tax revenue, which means that India funded infrastructure that primarily served the British strategic and commercial interests, instead of being focused on serving the people's needs. The same can be said for the telegraph network as well. So even the administrative costs of the colonialism was borne by the Indian subjects, and the colonial administration apparatus, military installations, and the lavish lifestyles of the British officials in India were all financed by Indian taxation. In short, Indians have funded their own subjugation. So the next part will be starting with the early resistance movement challenging colonial authority.